jobs some people do not want to do, and some jobs that according to some health codes they shouldn't have been doing without proper precautions. For these women, these jobs were what they could do after all to jobs that pay the rent, like the radium girls. The radium girls were female factory workers who contracted radiation poisoning from painting radium dials on watch dials and hands with self-luminous paint. The legacy of the radium girls says that the creation of the workplace safety regulations and of government oversight organizations like the Occupational Safety and Health Administration completely ignored it. By 1927, more than 50 women had died because of the radium paint poisoning, but the radium girls' story doesn't end there. The girls, who were also able to stay alive despite the toxic radium, were also sudden local celebrities dubbed the Ghost Girls because of their ever-present green glowing skin. Today, 100 years later, the women's bodies still glow in their graves as the effects of the radiation poisoning. Scientists were aware it could break down human tissue and it had a wide early success with cancer patients. In fact, it is still used today in cancer treatments, but it didn't discriminate in the tissue on how it broke down, and despite the danger, radium became widely popular with the public starting in the 1900s. They were very super luxurious, high-end radium spas where the rich and famous shelled out big bucks to clean and rejuvenate themselves with radium, reputed magical health effects, or at least what they thought was healthful. The legacy of the radium girls can't be understood, but their case among the first in which a company was held responsible for the health and safety of its employees, which had led to a variety of reforms as well as the creation of the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Once World War I had begun, this started to change in the workforce as there was a significant increase in the number of women employed in factories, and these women would be filled in the number of roles. They ran drill presses, did welding, operated cranes, screwed machines, and handled all the manner of metalworking equipment. Yet these women did more than just manual labor. They were also involved in production design, lab testing, drafting rooms, warehouse work, and driving trucks. The women shared the same risks as their male counterparts and did the same work. They were expected to produce at the same rate as the men, yet oftentimes they were paid less for the same work. It is not uncommon that the idea of women workers in factories were being a person's mind of the World War II era, but it was still a great war that needed a number of women in factories did it truly begin to increase. Helping around the house isn't that bad unless it's your job and your employer is a maniac. For some women in the 1700s to 1800s, and even to current times, their jobs were always left with scrutiny as a position as a woman was seen less and second-class citizens. Likely driven by the necessity to work for a living, employment was also appeared to be influenced by the race and immigration status. For the same reason, a need to work, younger women, 51% of the women ages 16 to 24, appeared listed as being gainfully employed much more than the 30% of the older women aged 25 to 44. But of course, younger demographic of the domestics would be more appealing than, let's say, an older one. Considering earnings were essential for everyday living, relying on your husband or non-existent ones is damning for a woman regardless of her status if she didn't have her own money. So for some women, they would have to do other jobs like other men, and when it came to some medical stuff, some involved working for hire to go into the woods for those suffering from bad blood. So the best way to cure you was to stick leeches on you and hope they could suck the bad blood out. And in order for your local family doctor to procure these little tiny vacuum cleaners with teeth, they would get a leech collector, or some women who would also hire themselves as leech collectors to do the job. Of course, they didn't have any protection as they would also wander the murky leech-infested waters with their long dresses, and also the hundreds of thousands of parasites that lurked within, but still, this job was pretty high in demand and a woman needed to work, so. Although it was also seen as a level of freedom for some women at the time, it did have its drawbacks and danger. If you wanted a career as a saloon owner or a bartender in the Wild West, while like all occupations in this time came with its own sets of risks and challenges. Saloons were centers of the social and economic life of frontier towns, but they were also associated with a wide range of issues including lawlessness, violence, and economic uncertainties. Saloons were often rowdy establishments where these patrons engaged in heavy drinking, gambling, and occasional brawls, and if you're a woman saloon owner and bartender, or vice versa, this was also a risk for you and your establishment, as considering it would erupt your establishment, leading to injuries and property damage, as well as some saloons attracted outlaws and criminals seeking refuge or engaging in illegal activities. Saloon owners could find themselves entangled with criminal elements, leading to legal troubles and conflicts with law enforcement. Bartenders, of course, would be working long hours to often challenging themselves in these conditions. Dealing with unruly patrons, managing inventory, and maintaining a clean and safe environment were always constant, important tasks that required skill and resilience. And speaking of those saloons, as they would appear in every town, were also your average pit stop on the long way journey, and if you're a man who hasn't seen or felt the touch of a woman in a long time and you could afford it, you might stop by a certain saloon for a drink and quench whenever you felt thirsty in many ways. Like a gentleman's club, most Wild West saloons catered most exclusively to these white men on the frontier, though women could sometimes find work in bars as dance hall girls or workers of the evening. And of course, if you have the madame of the house, which as I mentioned could be the owner of the saloon, making sure the security of her girls were okay. But of course, money and gold rushes were more valuable than the average person's life. Quote unquote respectable women didn't frequent wild saloons, but instead women who were less concerned about their reputations might find work there. Many saloon girls were widows, and they had no other means of supporting, or young girls who were just seeking something more than working on their family farm. The girls were there to dance with the men and get the men to buy them drinks. Earning as much as $10 a week, most saloon girls made commission from the drinks they sold, as whiskey sold to the customers were generally marked up to 30 to 60% over its wholesale price. But like all the dames who worked in these type of eras were definitely in her bag, as her status would also be noted and gossiped through town. One famous saloon girl was known as Fanny Porter. Fanny's family arrived in Texas when she was just 1 year old. Growing up as both an immigrant and in the middle of the Wild West may have inspired her to the sporting life, as she took up the trade as a teenager and opened her own brothel at the age of 20 in San Antonio. To the women who couldn't afford anything though, they'd also be left to doing something else, begging on the streets. Although you'd be surprised, yes, 100% this was a profession in the medieval times, and no, it wasn't a 9 to 5 gig, as it was more of I'm forced to do this because I have no other choice kind of gig. Being a beggar included laborers, hangmen, and night walkers, as well as other craftsmen, and most of these exceptions of these craftsmen were located outside the municipal jurisdictions and were left to be on the outskirts of town. And of course for these women, due to the caste systems laid out in the medieval times, they were also surrounding themselves with other people who were suffering from leprosy, who were also part of the group. And the mistreatments of being a beggar was considered vagrancy, and if you were caught begging, you would be forced to be branded with a V on your forehead and enslaved for 2 years. If you ever worked in a kitchen or in the food industry, you know how important it is to get your work, health, and safety certification, what chemicals not to mix, and making sure the kitchen is spotless to reduce pests, and of course making the customer happy with their order. But for scullions, they were considered the lowest of the kitchen workers, most of the time would being women, would have the duties being washing and cleaning the kitchen. I mean, that doesn't seem too bad, it basically sounds like your modern take of the busboy, but for scullions, they didn't have modern cleaning supplies or the safety gear. Medieval guests would typically eat with their hands, so the cleanup job of the food was like cleaning after a toddler. Cleaning up the kitchen was also no walk in the park either, as it was also dealing with conditions of slaughtered house era type of thing, like blood, gore, and filth, and the concept of cross-contamination didn't exist, so the smell and the slaughter of dead animals would be very prevalent, and guess who had to clean that up? Also considering the scullion, also including scullier maid, hospitality is a lot of work, and a lot of domestic workers should be given credit where credit is due. But in this case instance, specifically in the medieval times, is the medieval scullery maid. Working in the kitchen, having to clean up after your employer, working in the kitchen, having to pluck pheasants and cook and serve and clean and all the other tense hazardous conditions. Many of them would have to do dirty and unpleasant jobs and be forced to do long hours and hard work. And considering many of the jobs on this list were dirty, dangerous, and thankless, anyone doing these jobs were always looked down on. And finally, surprisingly, when it comes to women, they also had the opportunity to work in the mines. Throughout America's history, women have played a critical role in mines and mining operation, often in the face of prejudice and other hardships due to their gender. During Women's History Month, we recognize that the contribution women have made in the mining industry and their roles in creating opportunities and better working conditions in the mines. In the 19th century, women worked in mines as prospectors, ore processors, miners, managers, and even mine owners. Women's grub stakers, quote unquote, grub stakers sometimes financed the initial cost of prospecting in order to return for part interest in any claim. Although there is no federal law prohibiting women from working in the mining industry, tradition, cultural restraints, and employer resistance all limited the women's opportunity for employment in mining. This began in the change in 1960s, as we know mining is a dangerous occupation and miners face a variety of environmental and industrial hazards. In 1979, there were 144 mining fatalities, and one of them was Marilyn McCusker, a roof bolter helper and the first woman coal miner to die on the job. But she wanted to prove, as to so many other women, that if they liked the job, and if it was great, even though it was taxing, gave a lot of strength to show, as it was shown through their diligence in history. And of course, speaking of history, that's all for today. Thank you for watching, be sure to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. My name is Jess, and I wish you all the best. Bye!